it's 3:50, and we are about 10 minutes late, right? So why don't we just dive into the second session, David?
That sounds good to me. So I'm going to get on with it. So I share my screen.
Please.
And start the second presentation. So I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at the materials that Dong-Il circulated on Friday, but one of those includes an information guide on the guidelines that were adopted. And in that information guide, we do describe the steps to put the guidelines into practice. And much of that was based on practices described in something called the GSBPM. And in this presentation, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about that and how to use the generic statistical business process model as part of our work in implementing the guidelines at national level and supporting the development of guidance on that for other countries. So this thing called the GSBPM was first developed in 2008 by the Joint UN Economic Commission for Europe, Eurostat, and OECD Group on Statistical Metadata, or METIS. So this is a working group for essentially national statistical officers for statistically developed countries, put it that way. And the current version was released in January 2019. So there's quite an extensive experience in using this model in planning and going about our statistical business.
Sorry, David, could you share your screen?
Oh, I thought I had done so. I see what I failed to do. My apologies. I think it's this one. Okay, can you see the screen now? Can you see the slides? Good.
Yes.
Thank you. I missed out a small step. I'm 67 years old. Sometimes I'm a little bit challenged. Give me old-fashioned statistical code and I can manage with that, but pressing buttons and following things is another question. Okay. So I won't repeat what I just said, but so the current version of the generic statistical business process model was released in January 2019. You have copies of this presentation, and there's a link to the website in there, in this blue part here. I won't press the button because it'll take us there. But what the GSBPM does is describes and defines the set of business processes needed to produce official statistics. It provides a standard framework and harmonized terminology to help statistical organizations to modernize their processes. It provides a template to define and describe statistical processes in a coherent way, and a framework for process quality assessment and improvement. So it's not a highly technical document, if you like. It's a set of practical steps that allows us to follow the work clearly. It has 8 overall phases, starting with specifying needs and ending up with evaluating what you've done. There is a design phase, a build phase, collect the data phase, processing, analyzing, disseminate, evaluate. Not all of these processes are necessarily going to be relevant for our work. Particularly important will be specifying needs and evaluating what is already available in the statistics. The GSBPM also provides information about overarching processes that affect each of these phases, including quality management, metadata management, and data management. Now, for this project, metadata management, so managing the information about the statistics, information about the data that comes out of specification of needs, design, build, evaluate in particular, is going to be, it will be quite an important part of this process. It's important not necessarily to think of the GSBPM in a linear way, in the way it was presented on the previous slide, but rather as a cycle. Typically, one might start by specifying needs, designing, building, collecting, processing, analyzing, getting to the end and evaluating. But you can also, depending on the project, you can mix and match the bits that need and that are relevant. So it's not seen as a rigid framework in which all steps must be followed in a strict order. It identifies the possible steps in the statistical business process and the interdependencies between them. We could see it, think of it as a checklist that makes sure, that allows us to make sure that all the necessary steps have been considered in designing a statistical process or in producing a report, making recommendations, which is what we'll be doing. Or a cookbook to identify all the ingredients of a statistical business process is another way that it's been described. Ultimately, it's seen as a reference model that may be used by organizations to different degrees. So it's not some rigid structure that we all must follow. It's an information resource that helps us to ensure that we're doing things as thoroughly as we can. Now, the GSBPM has 3 levels, if you like, the overarching processes. Then level 1 is essentially the broad phases, specifying needs through design, build, through to evaluate. And then within each of those, there are sub-processes. So in specifying needs, we have identify needs, consult and confirm needs, establish output objectives, identify concepts, etc. So sort of mapping this GSBPM model onto some of the work that we're going to need to do in this project to evaluate and assess the national situation with respect to statistics of cooperatives, and to make recommendations on the way forward. We need to undertake various types of preparatory work to identify the national requirements and landscape for statistics of cooperatives. So that is essentially part of identifying needs. So we need to understand the national requirements for statistics of cooperatives. What is relevant for statistics of cooperatives at the national level? Obviously, the guidelines specify things broadly at the international level. There might well be specific national needs that also need to be taken into consideration. We need to look at the national laws and administrative structures that are relevant to cooperatives. We need to understand which agencies are interested in cooperatives or have responsibility for cooperatives. So are they government? Is there a government agency, or are there multiple agencies responsible for cooperatives? Are there confederations of cooperatives? research institutions that are interested in them and already have data or research about them, and what types and subtypes of cooperatives are recognized in the country. So having collected all of that information, we need to describe and understand the broad statistical outputs needed to implement the guidelines in the country. So this corresponds, that letter E there corresponds to the GSBPM established output objectives. So much of what's defined and described in the GSBPM specified needs phase is highly relevant to our work. But also, having understood the needs, we need to evaluate existing data available. It may be that all the needs are met. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So we have to identify and evaluate existing data, survey questionnaires, databases, sample frames, and other information and resources that could be relevant to compile the statistics we need. So the investigation needs to cover data collection and compilation activities undertaken by national statistical officers, research institutions, government agencies that are responsible for cooperatives, agencies responsible for promoting economic activities in sectors where cooperatives are important, for example, agriculture, possibly the retail sector, housing, agencies responsible for registration of businesses, and cooperative federations, all of whom would hold information about businesses, some of which will be cooperatives. And again, the GSBPM helps us in that it provides detail, well, some guidance about what's required in a generic sense here. So the last part of specified needs includes check data availability. We have to gather evaluation inputs from or about all of these different agencies. We need to conduct the evaluation and then agree with the agencies concerned or agree together on an action plan, which ultimately will enable us to prepare and submit a business case. And the national reports are at least going to need to go as far as describing what the action plan might be, making recommendations about the action plan and possibly making recommendations about the business case for it. It would also be important at this point, in this part, as a part of the preparatory work, to assess the suitability of existing statistics for the measurement of any economic performance of cooperatives. Whilst significant further work's needed to do that fully, the suitability of existing sources should still be assessed to compile statistics on the conventional indicators of economic performance proposed in the guidelines: employment, revenue, turnover, etc., value added. But this would first require the capacity to identify cooperatives in those sources. And yes, cooperatives will be identified in a cooperative census, but they're not necessarily going to be identified in an economic census of the whole country. Once cooperatives can be identified in these sources, then testing should involve trying to compile estimates for cooperatives for each of those variables and to assess the reliability and usefulness of the resulting statistics. If in the meantime we come across some additional information that actually might even better measure the economic contribution of cooperatives, if we find some information in the cooperative census, for example, that does that, then that will be important information to record. And some elements of the design and build phases will also be relevant for our project. And the design and build phases are closely related. Sort of, well, it refers to designing, first of all, and this is important that this is put first, designing the outputs. What statistics do we actually want to produce and compile before we start designing descriptions of the variables used to measure them and the questions that we might ask in a survey to collect that information. So a lot of people, when they're developing statistical outputs, when they're developing new statistics, start by talking about questions. We actually need to start by talking about outputs. And the build phase also importantly talks about reusing or building collection instruments. So you don't necessarily need to build a new survey, but rather have a look at existing collection instruments that exist to see whether there are modifications that can be made to allow the outputs that you want to be produced. And if you are developing a new collection instrument or a new survey, or if you're adding information into an existing survey, look at options to reuse or build processing and analysis components as well. So how's this relevant to our upcoming work? Well, first of all, concerning building statistics of cooperatives collected from businesses, designing and building them, there is a need to develop and test methods to collect data from businesses and from administrative and statistical registrations and censuses and surveys. Sorry, to start again. There's a need, first of all, in part to focus on collection of data from businesses and to develop and test methods to collect data from businesses in various different types of source, such as administrative registers or statistical registers, censuses or surveys. When we talk about a statistical register, a statistical business register, this is really an adaptation of an administrative, it's an adaptation for statistical purposes of a register, of a commercial register of businesses. And I'll talk more about this on Thursday. And in the first instance, this should be to identify cooperatives and also types of cooperatives, producer, worker, etc. And then subsequently to identify subsidiaries of cooperatives and enterprises that are producer members of cooperatives. So when a country is trying to implement the guidelines, rather than necessarily trying to get all of this information at once, it's going to be easier to identify cooperatives, and it's likely to be easier to identify types of cooperatives than it is subsidiaries and enterprises that are producer members. It's not to say that the first thing is necessarily more important than the last thing mentioned. This is the logical order in which it should be done. Now, it's also important to note that it's not expected that national consultants would be involved at this stage in testing their methods and questions, not as part of this consultancy at least. But the recommendations and proposals for designing and testing new questions or modifications to existing surveys or to statistical outputs should be included in the national reports. So you need to be aware of, to know about these phases as well. And similarly, we need to design and build statistics of cooperatives collected from households. Households are an important source of statistics about employment and also a source of statistics about people who are members of cooperatives. So we should be developing, there is a need at national level to develop and test methods and questions to be used in household surveys and possibly even in the census to identify, firstly, employees in cooperatives. And it's possible, we believe, that adapting an existing question on institutional sector of the employer would allow this to be done. And again, we'll talk more about that on Thursday. And then to focus on identifying producer members who are owner operators of their own enterprise, and members of cooperatives, and members and memberships of cooperatives in general. So yeah, again, this is not an order of priority, but an order of feasibility. So the first thing is likely to be easier than the second thing and the third thing. So logically, we should try and focus on employees first. But once again, if there are opportunities to identify producer members, we shouldn't just focus on the first thing, we need to try and focus on everything. And once again, it's not expected that you'd be involved at this stage, but you need to make recommendations about what should happen in the reports that you're going to produce. Should, however, an opportunity present itself, if, for example, it turns out that there is a test going on in the field for various aspects of the labour force survey this year, is there an opportunity to start testing, for example, the identification of employees in cooperatives? So in conclusion, the guidelines describe the statistical units, definitions and classifications needed to collect and compile internationally comparable statistics on cooperatives, types of cooperatives, members of cooperatives, and work in cooperatives. Significant research and methodological development work will be required to fully implement the guidelines at national level. And for any country adopting the guidelines, essential first steps will be to establish the requirements for statistics on cooperatives at national level, to understand the cooperative landscape in the country. What are the laws about cooperatives, etc.? Which organizations are interested in cooperatives? Who are the players? To identify the broad statistical outputs required, and to identify and document existing data and resources relevant to compile the statistics needed. Importantly, this should involve building a repository to record information on questions used, on variables that exist that are relevant, and on related metadata. There's a need to evaluate existing data and resources, to describe strengths, limitations, and to identify gaps and the needs for improvement. Now, this applies both to the national data that currently exists, but also to the guidelines themselves. And that is likely to involve identification of potential new sources of data about cooperatives, which could be an existing collection that simply doesn't collect information about, doesn't identify cooperatives, and therefore modifications to existing data collections that will be needed to fully implement the guidelines. I'm not expecting that in many cases that there will be a need for completely new sources, but if there's a cooperative confederation that's never conducted a census of all cooperatives, that is possibly an option that could be considered. So that is all for this part of the second orientation session. Do people have questions, comments?
David, why don't we go into the homework first and then invite questions?
We can do that.
Yeah.
How are we going for time? 16:15. Okay, we can do that. So I just press on and give this. Yep. Yeah, I think this is good. So this is a short presentation that covers the preparatory work to implement the guidelines. And we then will come to the homework that we're asking you to do between now and Thursday, which I think is an important thing we don't miss. So, first of all, before we get into trying to design new questions or anything else, or assessing and evaluating existing data, we need to understand what the national policy concerns related to cooperatives are, what statistical outputs are needed to inform these policies, and then understand the strengths and limitations of the statistics and other information that already exists about cooperatives in the country, and what the challenges are involved in collecting the information needed. Without understanding these requirements, it wouldn't really be possible to justify spending money or using skilled staff to work on development field testing of new questions and surveys. Nor would it be possible to determine whether the information would be useful. Importantly, implementation of the guidelines should reflect national realities and needs. There are wide varieties in cooperative laws, administrative structures for cooperatives, and the types of cooperatives that exist in different countries. Consultation and dialogue between producers of statistics, including national statistical officers, and users of statistics, as well as with national experts on cooperatives, are essential. So these users and experts should be drawn from government agencies responsible for cooperatives, cooperative federations, academia, and government agencies responsible for employment and economic development, especially in the sectors where there are lots of cooperatives, obviously agriculture in those countries. And this can help us to create a coalition of support at national level for the development of statistics on cooperatives. And in the slide, it says possibly through the formation of a working group or advisory group. And this is an important role of the National Advisory Committee that I think has now been established or developed in all 5 countries. Yeah. So that's a very important role of the group, is not just to oversee the work, but to provide support for the development of statistics on cooperatives in the country. So reviewing and understanding the national cooperative landscape requires a review of national laws and administrative structures relevant to cooperatives, to identify the agencies responsible and areas where the international guidelines might need to be adapted to reflect realities. So, for example, at national level, the operational definition of a cooperative might need to be aligned with and include terms based on the national cooperative laws, and the types of cooperatives recognized at national level could be mapped to the typology provided in the guidelines. And you might also want to identify specific subtypes of cooperatives, more detailed than the 4 very broad classes in the international guidelines, for which a separate statistics should be produced in the country. Now, the checking of data availability, identifying existing data relevant to compile the statistics, should allow evaluation of the extent to which the required statistics can be compiled from existing sources, identify gaps, allow identification and sharing of information about good practices, as well as proposals to modify existing data collections. An important element of this, if statistics are found in multiple data sources, would be to compare, cross-check, and to the extent possible, validate the information. So if there are 2 sources of statistics about the number of cooperatives and the types of cooperatives, etc., are they actually consistent with each other, or are they giving us different numbers? So I'm moving straight now to the checklist. We have developed a checklist relatively short. I think it's about 5 pages, 20 something questions, which we would like you to use to make initially an assessment relevant to, well, basically that allows us to identify national requirements of the landscape for statistics cooperatives. Initially, it should provide a framework to record information on the governance, legislation, and registration arrangements for cooperatives in the country, the requirements and demand for statistics about cooperatives, currently available statistics, and the potential future sources of those statistics. What we want you to do, what we're asking you to do between now and day 2, that's the national consultants, is use the checklist to record all relevant information that either you already know or you can easily find on the internet or other sources. And what we'll do on Thursday is ask you to share the results and provide feedback on the checklist itself in 3 to 5 minutes. So this is in part to get you familiar with the checklist, to give us something to talk about, how to fill the checklist in and what the issues are with it, rather than you trying to do all the work in the next 2 days. So don't try to include any information that needs extensive research or consultation with informants. Basically, what information can you quickly provide? And then following further research and interviews with relevant informants, you can use the same checklist to record more complete information. So the idea is that the checklist gradually fills up. You shouldn't see it as being restrictive. The idea is simply to get a degree of consistency between the work in the 5 different countries, and hopefully to ensure the information's comprehensive. If there's time, I guess I can briefly run through the questions, or would you prefer us to go straight to opening the discussion, Daniel? I just need to find the questionnaire. So I don't know whether you've had a chance to have a look at it, but essentially at the beginning, we explained what I've just explained, that we're not expecting you to answer every question. And there are, of course, some questions that you won't be able to answer at all between now and Thursday. And you should add as much space as needed to record information, complete information as possible. So it's not like filling out a form, it's rather a structure in which you can record the information. The first question simply asks if there's a government agency or ministry with general responsibility for cooperatives, provide the name, send links to contact details. If you have any, you may not have any informants there yet. You may already have some. Just put initially whatever information you have and describe what the agency's main functions are with respect to cooperatives. If that's possible now, it may not be. You may need to start to interview informants there first. Second question asks whether there are other government agencies or ministries that have a department or section that might be responsible. And then again, for each such agency, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture may have a cooperatives department, the housing department might have a department responsible for cooperatives. Just provide essentially the same information for each ministry or government agency that has an interest in cooperatives. Third question asks if there's a national legal definition of cooperatives. There may be or there may not be. You may know what that is already. You may know where to find it. you may have to do more research. If you have to do more research, just skip the question for the time being. And then do any of those agencies that you've already identified have their own definitions or criteria for defining cooperatives? And if they do, and there's a national legal definition, can you describe the differences? Is there a real impact between these different definitions, etc.? So we've developed these questions simply to try and give you a clear framework. If you find other information that's relevant, then by all means find a way of recording it within the framework of this form. So it shouldn't be a restrictive form. There's then a section on registration of enterprises and cooperatives. The idea of this is to find out what information is already available in national registers, such as in nearly all countries, there's a company register or commercial register which provides information about all businesses. The question is here, what's that agency? Where's the information? And can you separately identify cooperatives on that measure, on that register? The answer in most cases will be no, I think. And if you can, what criteria or methods are used to determine that an enterprise is a cooperative? Question 8 sort of looks at, well, okay, there might be other registers in which information about cooperatives might be identifiable. So, for example, housing cooperatives might be in a separate register managed by the Department of Housing or some other agency. And again, record some basic information about that, whatever information you can find. And if there is such a register, you may need to do some additional research eventually to find out what methods are used to determine whether an organization is a cooperative. Similarly, cooperative confederations may or may not exist in the country. There might be a national federation, there might be more than one, and there might be regional confederations, or there might be confederations for cooperatives in a particular government sector. Sorry, in a particular economic sector, such as agriculture. And once again, record whatever information you can find initially. Question 11 asks what types and subtypes of cooperatives are recognized in the country. Again, you may already know this, or you may need to do further research to find out that information. Are there academic and research institutions in the country that are interested? Record some information about them and provide links to any relevant publications or reports. That then will serve as something that you need to check as part of the information gathering process later on. We then start to get more into the statistical side of things. And it may be more difficult to get this information between now and Thursday. So do any of the agencies that we previously identified use statistics on cooperatives, or include them in their publications? And then some questions to provide some information about that, including what the statistics are used for. Much of this you might have to collect directly from informants in those agencies. Do any of these agencies have unmet needs for statistics about cooperatives? Again, this is not something that we would expect you to be able to answer between now and Thursday. It would require an in-depth discussion with informants or experts, or review of national reports perhaps, but sort of what government programs or policy concerns in relation to cooperatives are there, and to what extent do these concerns need to be informed by statistics on cooperatives that are not available? So it might take quite a discussion with people in ministries to actually get them to understand what we mean by unmet needs, because they may not be aware of them. And then question 15 definitely shouldn't be answered just now, but if the attempt there is to try to summarize what the national needs are. 16, do any of those agencies conduct regular censuses or surveys and then provide detail for each such data collection? Then the last 17 relates to official national statistics. So is there a national statistical office? So which agency has the main responsibility for official national statistics? In most countries, there's a national statistical office or institute. In some countries, there are a department in the Department of Finance, in the Ministry of Finance, or there might be a department in the Ministry of Planning. There might be more than one agency depending on the topics. There might also be a national statistics authority or something like that, or council that has responsibility for coordination of statistics. So basically, who are the important players in the production of official statistics in the country? And then are cooperatives or employment in cooperatives able to be identified in any of the statistics that these agencies produce? Question 19 refers to statistical business registers. And well, if they conduct an economic census or survey, they must have a business register adapted for statistical purposes. The question here is, can you identify cooperatives on them? And the last question relates to what existing or planned data collections could potentially be used in future to provide information about cooperatives, various types of information. And once again, this is not something that you're going to be able to answer between now and Thursday. So really, the idea here is to give you a couple of days to give us some feedback on the questionnaire and to start thinking about how to collect this information so that we can have a discussion about it when we next meet on Thursday. Thank you. So I'm sure there must be questions now. We've got 25 minutes left.
So while you are thinking of questions, I will introduce the next step. If we finish this meeting today, I will share the materials for day 2 on Tuesday night, hopefully. And then on the day 2, we would start with Hyungsik's speech regarding the previous country studies, and then we can discuss about the results of this homework, about 20 or 30 minutes maximum, and then revisit David's session again.
Yeah. So I'll be talking about sources and methods to collect the information, and then also how to go about auditing and reviewing existing and potential data sources.
And also, you can ask by email or something during from now to Thursday, and then David could answer for those questions at the beginning of the day 2.
That's a good idea.
So, is there anyone who has questions regarding this session or about the homework?
I think from my side, everything's very clear. Everything was very straightforward, especially on the homework. So all's good.
I don't think it'll be straightforward as we progress, but it's good to hear that everything was clear.
Actually, Carlos has the same comments on the TOR itself.
Yeah, I should take myself saying that so I can use it every time everything's clear. But yeah, everything's real clear with the homework. Actually, already started doing it on the weekend, and yeah, it was very easy, a little bit time consuming, but it was easy. It's just to try to find all public available information. So yeah, it was kind of easy.
Yeah. I think the idea is to give you people a framework to collect the information, and it's for you to work out how to use it. But if there are issues, if anything's unclear about what it is that the information that we're wanting, or if it's just too time consuming to record all this information, then we need to know that before you all start wasting your time. And the idea would then be that the information that's there will be able to be used to help you to evaluate, help you to identify everything that you need, and then to evaluate the relevance of the existing information and identify the gaps in the statistics that are needed. And that is probably going to be the more difficult phase of this work. And then putting it all together into a report. So I would hope to be able to propose to you the outline of a structure for the report, for the country reports on day 2. I'll certainly have something. But again, this is something that you can use to make sure we get a coherent and consistent type of report from each country, but also that you would need to adapt to suit the national requirements. And again, when we discuss that structure on Thursday, you may wish to suggest improvements or modifications to it. It's not something that the ILO and myself are trying to impose on you, but rather to provide a vehicle and framework to help you in the work.
And I suppose there can be some more comments or thought from other colleagues rather than national consultants. So if you have any comment or thought or any idea to improve our process to get the result, please.
Maybe a quick, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, David, for all this presentations and the very clear homework that you're giving everyone. I was wondering if it would be too much of a burden, or if it would make sense to already identify organizations that are not called cooperatives, but according to the people in the country are cooperatives. And just to point them out so that we we have an idea of the relevancy of the concept of cooperative, or maybe that's too dangerous at this point, or I'm not sure.
I think that if consultants feel able to do that at this stage, that will be useful. But it might be a little bit early. But certainly if consultants are aware of types of enterprise that are considered to be cooperatives, but might not really be cooperatives according to the international definitions, or that are not called cooperatives in the country, but that appear to be functioning as if they were cooperatives, it would be useful to understand that. And as national consultants, some of you may already be aware of these types of entity.
Will,
Yes.
may I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I don't know whether the previous the country case studies might be available for the national consultant or not, because first of all, some countries are already covered in that studies. Costa Rica, Korea, Italy, So, and although they are not directly answering to all the checklists, I think it would be useful for for them to understand better and to find some information. But I don't know the corporate unit wanted to make it available with them or not, because it's not in public. These two documents are not in public, so you need to decide whether you would share the documents. You are muted. Dongil, I don't hear you.
Dongil, you
Okay.
Yeah.
After this meeting, I will share all documents that I can share with you, especially regarding the country studies, previous studies.
Okay, great.
That's good. I think that'll be helpful for the national consultants.
Yeah.
You don't want to do this work again if it's already been done.
Sure. Yeah.
But obviously, I think the reports that Hyung-sik was referring to are probably a few years old now as well. So there may be some more up-to-date information.
Yes, that's why I asked Hyung-sik ask a presentation, a speech about regarding the previous country studies. Yeah. Is there any other comments or questions from other colleagues? Don't hesitate. In the meantime, is there any question about the process afterward? On Thursday, we have day 2. We will have day 2 of this orientation session. And actually, we didn't launch NAC officially, but we have already some tentative list from our colleagues in each country. So you can contact them and arrange the first day, the first meeting. I mean, the launch of the NAC between yourself from mid-June or early July. Before that, you can prepare the materials for the launch of NAC, which are on the TOR already. No more comments or question? It's about 12 midnight in Korea, especially. Thank you, Dr. An. I can see your brain is sleeping already. But thank you.
Yeah, I have to say thank you to David and I think we can talk about it more on Thursday with our, Cormac Dan.
So
Thank you very much for your attention, all of you, especially for those of you for whom this is either a very early start or a very late end to your working day.
I could see Tasum Kim raises her hand. So please.
Hello, I'm Dasum Kim. I'm from Korea Social Enterprise Promotion Agency, and I've been working for the measurement of cooperative impact in Korea, and I am interested in making the the measures for cooperative impact measurement, and I have been looking through the measures or indexes for cooperatives, and I found out that some I cannot find the right word, but some indicators that some indicators are very easy to find in Korea. For example, you can easily collect the data about how many general meetings each cooperative held every year. Those kind of data might be found easily in Korea, but I think that's less important to measure the impact of cooperatives, and rather it's hard for me to find the right words because I'm a little bit sleepy right now. Sorry.
I can understand
that. There are some indicators that is important to measure the cooperative impact, but sometimes it is hard to find the data in Korea. So I have question about if there are some indicators that are easy to collect data, and there are some indicators that are important but not easy to find data. There are no data available right now. So which would be your priority to collect the data?
Right. I think, first of all, it would be good to know what information is available. But it would also be very important to know what information that is considered to be relevant for the measurement of, especially of the economic impact of cooperatives. What information is not available, but that could potentially be made available. And part of this project, part of the process of developing and doing work to support implementation of the guidelines, is to actually get agreement on what indicators are both relevant and feasible to collect, and then work out how to go about getting that information. So, I mean, I don't think that we're going to end up doing, certainly not as part of this project. And in fact, the ILO, I think, is probably going to be looking at a separate project to develop better economic indicators for cooperatives. But we would certainly want to collect relevant information, I think, as part of this project on information that is relevant for measuring the economic, that exists for measuring the economic impact of cooperatives, but also information that is needed based on the research that you've been doing, and the fact that and which bits are available and which bits aren't, because that information could be used as input to this parallel process that needs to take place. And I don't know whether the ILO is in a position for that work to happen, but it's recognized that it needs to happen. But this question of measuring the special impact of cooperatives, measuring the cooperative difference, is quite difficult, both in terms of the data input needed and actually coming up conceptually with the right measures. I've read quite a lot of the literature around measuring the economic impact of cooperatives, and it's not easy to get a clear understanding of exactly what information is needed. So there's a lot more work needs to be done. So
and at the time you need to decide which indicator is important or not, I think there might be some difference. I mean, there might be some differences in climate between between the government agencies and the cooperative sector. So I think that might be that might cause an issue when you try to decide the indicators that should be included in the ILO statistics.
thank you.
Mari, please.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's very important. And of course, the cooperative movement and the government do not necessarily always want the same things, or do not always call the things the same way. So that is important. There is also always the question of costs of getting the information. So you might have that in mind. How much would it cost to get that information if we had to find it, versus the information that might be already available in data sets? And whether, the intention is to go through a census and a huge survey on cooperatives, or it's to go about a satellite account of the existing administrative accounts. So you might want, I guess, to have that in mind when you're thinking of adding new information about a cooperative.
Yeah. Or I think it's important to understand also that whilst it might be technically feasible to collect certain types of information in an economic survey of all businesses, there is a significant cost in collecting that information, and there's competition to get to add new questions to ongoing surveys, or to add questions to a census. So a National Statistical Office has to consider all of the requirements for statistics in order to determine sort of what new questions might be included in a survey when it's revised, or what information might be removed, and what will be the costs and what will be the benefits of collecting that information. So it's not a simple thing to add a question to a survey, to an ongoing survey, nor is it a simple thing to develop a new statistical collection.
Is there any other question or comment? If not, let us just close today.
There is
Oh.
Daniel, there's Ahmed.
Ahmed?
Yeah, I wanted to share my experience a bit.
Please.
Much as we would like to collect information that is compatible to the guidelines, I think we might also collect proxy data, alternate data, and maybe additional indicators that are relevant in the countries. But also when we collect data that is compatible with the guidelines, we might also need to consider what has been happening previously so that we don't lose the previous information that was used. So we can modify the questions so that we'll have the comparison with the previous data, but also then we can have information that is compatible with the guidelines. So that's what I wanted to contribute.
I think that's a very important point from Ahmed, because one of the national needs, if we put this back into GSB PM terms, part of specifying the needs can be, well, we need ongoing time series comparability. We don't want to throw out what we already have. We have this information that's been going on for a long time. So if we suddenly change the question, or if we make certain changes, or take this question out and replace it with this, we then lose the time series. So it's quite, there's a need therefore to weigh that up when specifying the needs and when evaluating the existing data.
Thank you for Ahmed, your suggestion. So, anyone else? Yes, it's almost 12 in Korea. We need to close today's meeting for now. And don't hesitate to share your additional thought or question by email. You can just reply to all to share all the questions or comments from our all colleagues. And see you on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.